I'm Christina Hochul, and I'm head of our Strategic Alliance Development Function at Alexion AstraZeneca Rare Disease. And it's my pleasure to introduce our esteemed moderator and panelists this afternoon. Our moderator is Tanisha Washington. Ms. Washington is the founder of the Washington Group and an associate professor at the University of Alabama of Birmingham School of Public Health. She has worked in the rare disease space for more than 5 years in a variety of capacities, including identifying contributing factors to low participation in patient registries, and more recently, around diversity, equity, and inclusion challenges within the rare disease space more broadly. Her research within academia is focused on fostering effective community engagement strategies within the disadvantaged communities among individuals with disabilities and rare diseases, as serves as an assistant professor in the UAB School of Public Health. Turning to our speakers, Barbara Harrison is a genetic counselor and assistant professor at Howard University. She graduated with a bachelor's degree in biology from the University of Maryland, College Park, and receives a master's degree in genetic counseling at the University of Pittsburgh. She is an assistant professor at Howard University and provides genetic counseling services at Howard University for a variety of referral reasons, including cancer and prenatal. Ms. Harris is the chair of the Warren Albert Alliance to Increase Diversity in Genetic Counseling and recently received on the All of Us Genetic Counseling Resource Advisory Board and the Alliance for Genetics and Genomic Diversity Advisory Group. She is also a member of the Minority Genetics Professional Network and co-founder of Golden, the Genetics Opportunity Learning, Development, and Empowerment Network, which is dedicated to increasing the number of Black genetic counselors by raising awareness and mentoring prospective applicants. She was recently awarded the 2020 National Society of Genetic Counselors Natalie Wessenberger Paul National Achievement Award, the Society's most distinguished honor. Dr. Shaka Cunningham is the co-founder and chief scientific officer at Polaris Genomics. He is a graduate of Princeton University, and he received his PhD in molecular biology from Rockefeller University. He previously worked at the Department of Veterans Affairs, overseeing a federally funded national research program in aging and neurodegenerative diseases, and serving as a subject matter expert for the VA's Genomic Medicine Implementation Program. He co-founded and serves as the executive director of a faith-based genetic research institute, a community-based nonprofit organization dedicated to improving people's lives through the power of genomics and precision medicine. He also serves as a board member of the Future Kings and Queens of STEM Biomedical Program, a STEM-focused nonprofit organization for youth for underserved communities in the DC area. Finally, Natasha Bonham is the founder of Expecting Health. She brings nearly 2 decades of nonprofit and maternal and children health experience to her role as founder of Expecting Health at Genomic Alliance. She launched Expecting Health to bring together a range of consumer and professional stakeholders to address the need for clear, science-based information for families and individuals through tangible, actionable messages. Her focus is on bringing public and families' perspectives into policy and program design and implementation. Her programmatic portfolio includes leading Babies First Tests, a national resource that reaches over 600,000 families and health providers annually. Being the program director for the HRSA-funded newborn screening family education program and participating on numerous committees on maternal health and dignified care throughout the prenatal and postnatal periods. She is an organizational representative to the Secretary's Advisory Committee on Hereditary Disorders in Newborns and Children's. Mrs. Washington, I'll turn the event over to you.
Okay, so for those who know me, They'll know that I don't like to read things, not that I can't read, but I don't like to read things, so bear with me. Priscilla did such a great job of making sure the program was where it needed to be. But I am so excited to be here, so excited to be among these fabulous individuals, and of course, so excited to be among you all this Rare Disease Week. So as I move into Barbara, I just want to make sure that we kind of preface this conversation in the way that we need to, thinking about how does this look in the rare disease space. So as we move into genetics, we do know the National Society of Genetic Counselors professional status found that 89% of all practicing genetic counselors identified as white, 9% as Asian, 3% as Hispanic, and 1% as Black African Americans, 3% as Middle Eastern, North African, and really, where do we even start to begin about the discrepancies and the disenfranchised when we think about genetic testing, how people have access to genetic testing, and thus far. In addition to that, Human Genomics and Genetics found similar race ethnicity statistics as the National Society of Genetic Counselors Professional Status Survey found that 74.7% of women, 23.3% men, and then 0.5% non-binary and transgender individuals actually talked about having access to genetic testing. So I say all of that to say that I am not the expert on genetic testing, and that's why Barbara is sitting and on the fabulous panel today.
All right, thank you so much. Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. Get a little bit of energy here. We're like in the last part of this, so I'm definitely happy to be here. Thank you so much to the Every Life Foundation for this invitation. I think there's really a missed opportunity for genetic counselors in the rare disease space. And so I'm hoping to bridge that today, begin bridging that. And I've had the opportunity to really interact with the rare disease community over this past year and just really hope that that continues. So as was so eloquently already pointed out, genetic counseling is really a space that I think can help address at least some of the issues that we face in the rare disease community. And so we know that over 80% of rare conditions have a significant genetic component, and that the benefits of genetic counseling and genetic testing in this community are clear. We know genetic counselors, and just for those who may not be familiar with genetic counseling, I wanted to preface a little bit with what we do and how we interact. So we assist individuals and families in understanding the genetic aspects of disease and help them through the process of genetic testing. So in addition to taking family histories and collecting medical information, genetic counselors really help families understand genetics, review the limitations and pros and cons of testing, and discuss how genetic information may affect someone from a psychological or even social standpoint. And of course, in that process, needing to incorporate cultural, spiritual, personal beliefs and values into that decision-making, as well as helping individuals navigate once those results become available and if they impact medical care or family issues, to help people navigate through that. And so we know that having access to genetic testing can expedite the diagnostic odyssey that many individuals with rare disease face. One of the key things I learned in my training was if you are faced with someone who has gone years without having a diagnosis but having symptoms that are seemingly unrelated, often the bottom line is the genetic answer, is the genetic condition. And so it's really important that individuals have access to genetic services as they're going through this journey, because it really could be a shortcut. It really could be a way for them to get to that answer. But we know that access is not equal. Access to genetic testing and genetic counseling isn't equal, and it's not equitable in our society. In addition to challenges with being uninsured or underinsured. Can be a general lack of awareness about the utility of genetic services. Why is this even useful? Why am I going to spend my time trying to get to a geneticist or to a genetic counselor, which are so few and far between? What's really the benefit of it? And I think there's sometimes a lack of understanding of what that benefit could be. And then on top of that, you have issues around workforce from a numbers perspective, as well as a diversity perspective, which has been mentioned. And because particularly of that lack of diversity, there's a significant lack of ethnic and cultural competency and humility among genetic counselors. And so that's something that we're definitely trying to address. But why is that even an issue? Why are there these barriers? Why does that even equate kind of to barriers in genetic services? And so this is a table that I took. It's from a paper. They're actually talking about cancer genetic services, but we know that some of those genetic cancer syndromes are indeed rare diseases. And so many of the barriers that are discussed here in this table are ones that are relevant to everyone really sitting in this room. So when we think about barriers to even seeing a provider, and this is just any provider, not even a genetics provider, we know that there can be barriers around provider access, to be able to even get to someone who can start to address the medical needs that an individual may have, time constraints, of course, cost and insurance, and then issues around medical distrust in general. And when we're talking about communities that are historically been minoritized, have been undervalued and under-resourced, then this issue around medical mistrust comes to the top. And it's mistrust for a good reason. It's not because it's unfounded, but I often say there's kind of a collective consciousness over generations. So even though someone may not have experienced something like the Tuskegee experiment, or even some of the atrocious things that happen among to slaves in African American community, 100 years ago, there's still that collective conscious that doctors aren't here to really help me. They're not here for my better good, so why am I even going to try to access those services? And so that trickles down even to today. Now, let's say someone gets to the point where they get that referral for a genetics provider. Now, there's, again, maybe that misunderstanding or not understanding about how that can be a benefit. Why am I going to jump through hoops with my insurance company to be able to find who's, the genetics provider in my plan, if there is one? And then how am I going to get there? And where do I access that? Often genetic counselors are located in large university medical centers. And so those are few and far between, depending on where you live. And so it may be hard to access us from that standpoint. And one of the reasons for that is because genetic counselors cannot bill directly for our services. So from a hospital standpoint, we really kind of cost hospitals and medical systems money. Now, I have to pause there, and I had to mention that because genetic counselors actually have an active bill we're trying to get passed through Congress ourselves called the Access to Genetic Counselor Services Act. And that's one that would allow CMS to recognize genetic counselors as providers and then therefore allow us to bill, which would then be a motivation for more medical systems and medical institutions to hire genetic counselors so that we could be in more places than just in these big, large medical centers. Now, telemedicine over the last, few years has helped with access, but we know that there's a digital divide in this country. And so if there's only about 5,000 genetic counselors in the United States, again, we're really spread across and spread across and also aggregate in certain areas. So this map on the right is really hard probably for you to see the numbers, but you can see the colors. And the darker colors indicate where there are the most genetic counselors. You can see California has a lot, which is great, but they're also still in those medical centers. If I was able to break that California down, you would see where they're kind of aggregated. And then we have areas, whole states, where there's only one genetic counselor or two genetic counselors to try to serve a whole state. So this lack of numbers is really a significant issue. So those are things that can be barriers to accessing care. And even if you get to a provider that is able to, get you to a genetic counselor or a geneticist, you get evaluated, and then they want to order genetic testing. And then we know there's loops and hoops to go through for genetic testing. And even if you get that genetic testing, even if your insurance pays for it, or even if you pay that huge copay or deductible that may come along with accessing that genetic test, now you need to try to understand that. What does that mean, and who are you having that conversation with? Which takes us back to that, who's giving you that information. If it's not a genetics trained professional, they may not fully understand what that result means. And there has been documented instances where genetic testing results have been misinterpreted and used in the wrong way. So all of these are really barriers and issues that we're dealing with just in general with genetic services. But then when we focus specifically on issues around diversity, again, it's been pointed out, these numbers that are right up here, so I won't recount them, but hopefully the point was made that genetic counseling is generally a very homogeneous field. And so that has had a trickle-down effect in and of itself. It affects our philosophy of how we practice. It affects the interests of those that come into the field and where they want to serve and where they want to see patients. And so it has left many communities just unserviced and unstudied. I've put up the numbers here as well as far as language. Only about 4% of genetic counselors speak Spanish. But we know that the number of individuals who speak Spanish in our society is much, much higher than that. So they're receiving services, sometimes not at all, and often in a language that they don't completely understand. And interpreters are great, but we know that communication is best when it's just that one-on-one conversation for a number of reasons. Now, how can we address this? It's mentioned that I have founded, along with a colleague of mine, a program specifically designed to increase the number of Black genetic counselors. And really having that intention is what's most important. And it spills over into who then is going to go out and try to search out those communities that have been underserved. Who's going to do that? People who come from those communities. So really intentionally going out and setting up genetic counseling programs at historically Black institutions or minority-serving institutions is really where we need to go with those efforts to change this narrative, right? Because that's something that's very important to us. And in addition to racial and ethnic disparities, we know there's even disability disparities in genetic counselors. I didn't even put those numbers up here because sometimes I think they don't, the questions we ask to try to get at that aren't asked in the best way. But I can tell you, we are a very able-bodied profession. You can see it when you walk into a room of genetic counselors and there's no space for wheelchairs. There's no translation going on. There's no, there's various things that really don't allow us to accommodate for people with different needs, different ways. The ways that genetic counselors are trained is very, very specific and really narrows down who can even successfully apply and then even get through programs for genetic counseling. So all these things are issues that we need to address. So this slide, and this is my really last real slide, I point this out because since genetic counseling and genetic testing, the effectiveness of that really lays on the foundation of genetics research. Because genetics research is what allows for there to be clinical genetic testing available that then can be offered to the broader community. And there have been significant flaws in the genetic research that has been done in terms of who has been included in that research. So on the left is a table that shows the demographics of individuals involved in what we call genome-wide association studies. And all that means is trying to make connections between our genetic sequence and disease. Who's been involved in those studies? And so that red portion are individuals of European descent. And then as you can go down and see, blue is those that are East Asian and so forth. And you can see that over the years, it was predominantly, and still is predominantly, those of European descent. When we look at genetics from a scientific perspective, the broadest diversity are from those that come from the African continent. And so by not including those individuals in those studies, it means that the information that we have gathered is really the tiniest tip of the iceberg of what is really going on. And so this has significant implications when we do genetic testing. And I just want to highlight two of those examples before I sit. So the first point I have here about how it can affect genetic testing is that you can have disease-causing variations in genetic information that end up being missed. And so a clear example of this is with cystic fibrosis, which is one of our dear rare diseases. Now, a lot of developments have come out recently with cystic fibrosis and therapies that are based on the genetic cause for the disease. And those have focused on those variations that cause disease that are most common. And this condition has been studied mostly in the European population. And so these therapies that have been developed are primarily being able to benefit those who are indeed European. But it's interesting because as cystic fibrosis has been studied more on the African continent, we have identified 20 new, novel, never been known before variations in the gene that causes cystic fibrosis. And that was only studying or doing studies on 12 of the 54 countries in Africa. So if we can even expand that and look at more, we'll identify even more changes. And I want to make clear that skin color and genetics they obviously have something to do with each other, but your skin color doesn't tell you what your genetics is. Right? So just because you're white on the outside, that doesn't tell me anything about what your genetics are on the inside. And so when we look at that more diverse pool, it really elevates everybody. It helps everybody. It doesn't just help a certain, segment of the population. So cystic fibrosis was a great example of how we were missing a huge amount of these variations that cause cystic fibrosis because we were just looking at this small population. And then the second and the last point I want to make is this second point here, which is genotype-phenotype correlations being overestimated. Now, genotype just means what your genetics are, right, if we look at your sequence. And phenotype is just what we see on the outside. So whether what we see on the outside is a genetic condition or some other variation. Now, familial hypercholesterolemia, which is a condition that causes extremely high levels of cholesterol. It's considered a rare disease as well. And what happened with FH that is exemplified here is that when they did studies on FH, they found that there were changes that they assumed were disease-causing because they were looking at this small European population. But as they broadened those studies, they found out that those variations really were not associated with disease. It's just that they hadn't looked at a broad enough range of people to figure that out. They were just looking at this small subset. And so you had people who received a diagnosis based really on erroneous information. They had made lifestyle changes, maybe started medications, assuming that they had a medical condition that they did not have. So, or they were expecting that they were going to develop this condition, and they never were because it was a normal variation. It just wasn't normal based on this small population that they had seen or had been studied. So where our research has been directly impacts where our testing is and then what benefit that has to our broader community. And so my last slide here is just this quote that I love, which is that, and I think it really points out where we need to go. So diversity is a fact. It's here. it's in everyone that we see sitting around this room. But whether we work to make our information, our genetic information, equitable to everyone is a choice. And the result of that would be inclusion. And then you end up with that belonging, that people feel like they belong around the table because they've been included in the efforts that have come. And I say this doesn't always only apply to genetic testing, but it applies to us. I do a lot of work with sickle cell. I work in advocacy, and it applies to our advocacy organizations as well. We need to be belonging to everyone, not just people that look like us, but for everyone, because we know that rare disease spans all ethnic backgrounds, all religious backgrounds, and so forth. And we need to remember that because it makes our organization stronger. Diversity is a necessary component of excellence. So if you want your advocacy organizations to be excellent, you need to have that broad range around the table. Thank you very much.
Okay, so awesome. Thank you. Another round of applause for Barbara. And I think that leads fantastically into our next speaker, and really thinking about this diversity from the perspective of engagement and what does that look like. So if you have a workforce of individuals, again, to Barbara's point, that don't necessarily look like you, or maybe they do, how do you go about bringing people that are different to the table? And we all know that when you will, at least I hope that we know that when you bring differences to the table, what ends up happening is the collaboration. You get new ideas. All of us are here for new ideas, new ways of thinking. So how do we do that? And how do we do that in a way that's going to engage people so that they not only want to be a part of it, but they trust us enough to want to take part in the activities that we do? So with that being said, again, Dr. Cunningham is more of an expert than myself, so I'll pass it to him.
Well, thank you, Tanisha, and thank you, Barbara. Thank you all for having me today. It's a real honor to be here. This is actually my first rare disease week, if you will, participating, all right? And I'll tell you, I got to speak at NIH's a Rare Disease Day event on campus yesterday. It was a really great honor. Again, I love that. I love the NIH. And I'm becoming not only a rare disease advocate, but an actual rare disease researcher. So I'm going to tell you guys more about that as someone who happens to be a person of color, who's also a scientist of color. I'm a PhD molecular biologist, and really love all things genetic and genomic. And my passion has been around some of the things that Barbara has talked about, is really democratizing our access and our participation in genomics and precision medicine. And so I try to do that in different ways. I'm going to share 4 points with you. I'm not going to go through slides, but I want to have a dialogue. I want to actually leave time for us to really talk about this, because it's something that concerns each and every one of us, whether we regard ourselves as an underrepresented minority or not. As Barbara mentioned, we all emanated as a species out of the continent of Africa. But as I stand before you today, less than 2% of all the DNA ever studied came from Africa, the continent of Africa directly. So I think that is something that we should all seek to change, and that's something that we can all be engaged on. So I'm going to leave you with 4 points on ways that I think we can all contribute to addressing some of these gaps in genetic research diversity regarding rare diseases and all diseases. The first thing we need to do, is late in the day, is train more scientists of color. We need to train more researchers of color wherever they are. By show of hands, how many of you know someone in your family or a close friend that's a biomedical research professional? Okay, put them down. All right, by another show of hands, how many of you know close friend, family, that's a biomedical research professional that's a person of color? Okay, you guys are pretty good, because actually there's more diversity in here than you normally see in a room when I ask that question. That's great. We need every hand raised when you do that, because the net effect, what you'll see is when you have researchers of color who are able to connect with communities of color, that creates a natural bond of trust that will help restore some of the bonds that have been eroded over time. So we often wonder why you don't see a lot of participation by minority populations historically in clinical trials and genetics and research. And a lot of it has to do with an ugly history of racial discrimination throughout the medical research enterprise. I was part of a American Society of Human Genetics Task Force, talking about how we kind of really address a shameful history of eugenics and what we do to move forward from that. But really speaking to these ugly sort of episodes in our past to get us to a brighter future. And that will start with having more people of color who are actually doing the research, talking about research, going into communities and being part of it. That's going to be a tall task, because the other kind of difficult fact that we're dealing with is we have a shortage of STEM workforce in this country right now. So every year across all of the STEM fields, 3 million jobs go unfilled. So whether it's in computer science, biomedical research, engineering, for Americans writ large, I'm not even talking about diverse Americans, there's a STEM job shortage. We're trying to address this multiple ways. There's a new task force that I'm actually a member of called the STEM Opportunity Alliance, which is seeking to really increase our participation in STEM training and STEM learning, but there's more work for all of us to do in that regard. And then I would say the third piece is we need to really have a focus on engaging minority communities where they are, right? So talking to people in barbershops, in churches, in civic groups, no matter where you can find a minority population that hasn't been addressed, getting to them where they are. Now, one of the organizations I work with called the Faith-Based Genetic Research Institute, that's what we do. We go into churches and we talk about genetics and precision medicine. And when we go there, we make sure that the folks who are doing the talking are also from the community. Again, having that diversity of scientists and researchers, being a resource for the community, we found that's been very effective because you become this honest broker for populations to actually build trust in your communications. And then finally, I would say with all of that, we need to start early. One of the other things that was mentioned that I engage in is STEM training for youth. And I have to say one of the great privileges that I've been able to have this past year, and this is my entree into rare disease, is through a training program that we have called Future Kings of STEM. One of the young men in our group, African-American male, has a rare disease. And when he made that knowledge known to his peers, they said, what can we do to help Marcellus? Marcellus has a rare genetic disorder called eosinophilic esophagitis, where it really affects the inflammation in his throat, and he can't eat many different things. So it would actually changed his whole social interaction, because when all the other kids were eating and socializing, he couldn't eat. He actually had a feeding tube up until very recently. And so what has happened, though, through research and advocacy in the rare disease community, there are now new drug treatments for his condition. And actually yesterday at NIH's Rare Disease Day, we were able to meet one of the researchers that actually developed one of those treatments that changed his life. Give him an applause, right? But that's not all of the shout, right? The real amen was what the effect it had on Marcellus. So now, as a result of Marcellus having a rare disease and wanting to take power over his rare disease, and because of this STEM training program we have, we're doing a rare disease research project. We're looking at the genetics, all of the genetics that cause his rare disease, and we're designing gene therapy vectors to try to address it. And so these are kids aged 12 to 18 learning to do this. That's going to be our next generation of scientists and researchers, and they all happen to be students of color. So can I get a round of applause for that? So these are simple interventions that we can all support, and it will help us all. It will help not only the rare disease community, but every community out there. And so I really am excited about that and want to see more of that happen. And then finally, I want to leave you all with something that I hope that we all do, because again, as a genetics researcher and as someone who loves everything genomics and precision medicine, I would encourage you all to participate. Just by show of hands, how many of you all have had your DNA sequenced? That's a fair number in here, but I want to see the day where this whole room has that sequence. Now, we have programs that are government sponsors, like the NIH All of Us program, and my organization, FBGRI, is doing a DMV outreach project, so consider this my outreach to you today. Go on the website, sign up for the NIH All of Us program, and get your DNA sequence, because as we say in the church, it's important for you to know thy genome. Okay? So we want to know our genome so we know what our risk is, not only for rare disease, but all disease, so we can have a brighter health future. Thank you all.
You know, I love that, Dr. Cunningham, this idea of, you know, in my background, we have this whole term of community health ambassadors and this idea of training individuals within faith-based communities. It doesn't have to be, you know, a Baptist individual or anybody. That the community members are trained on research methods. They're trained on how to, really, they train us on engagement, right? We think we come in as experts, and then we realize that we're really not the experts. The community members are. So that speaks value to the work, I think, not even just in rare disease, but what's happening broadly, this idea of trying to build the base of people within communities to be able to do the work that we all do so diligently. Last but not least, which is very exciting to me because Natasha's background is in maternal and child health, which is exactly what mine is in. So I'm really excited to hear more about rare disease and how it relates to newborn screening and thinking about how we can kind of broaden the umbrella for that. Barbara, I meant Natasha.
You looking at me?
Great, thank you. I know it's been a long day. Hang in there. But I'm really excited to be here. Thank you to EveryLife for inviting me to be part of this really illustrious panel. Today I'm going to be talking a bit about newborn screening, and we are celebrating 60 years of newborn screening. Very exciting, yes. And really to see where we are and, more importantly, where we can go next. I know I'm going to skip that slide, actually. So I wanted to at least ground us in some terminology. I know most of you know about newborn screening, so I won't go into too much depth with that there. But when we talk about public health, what do we really mean? The CDC Foundation has a great definition: the science and art of preventing disease, prolonging life, and promoting health through the organized efforts and informed choices of society. I will pause there because so often that's usually where the definition stops, really with society. But I think it's important that also listed here are organizations, public and private communities, and individuals. So back to what we were saying when we were up on that staircase, you know, every voice, that is part of public health. It's not just a numbers game, which sometimes we've been told. It really is about how does society support the health of all of us. And so some other terminology when thinking about equality and equity. Equality is leaving the door open for anyone who has the means to approach it. Equity is ensuring there is a pathway to that door for those who need it. And so just keeping that in mind, you know, we maybe in some places have done pretty well around equality, and that's great. We should be happy about that. But that's just on the journey to equity. So let's talk about newborn screening. It's great, 60 years, definitely deserve that round of applause. And there's a lot more that we could be doing, right? We talk about newborn screening as a system and as multiple components. And so I'm going to delve into that a little bit here. When we think about laboratory and what equity looks like or where we could have potentially some improvements, you know, we know that different states have different panels, so that is not equity. Different states have different mechanisms, there's different tiered testing, so that looks different. So there are sometimes questions of if someone would be caught in one state versus another state. We need to have dialogue, open dialogue about that. There's a difference in the rate of technology adoption. There are some states that are really, you know, moving very quickly ahead, looking at and incorporating molecular approaches in what they're doing. Other states that really are just trying to keep the lights on. And then also that there are different rates around false positives as well as false negatives. My next slide will go into more detail about that. So that's the laboratory side. What about follow-up and treatment? And I always remind people, newborn screening is not about testing. It's about getting kids into care and getting them treatment so that they have better health outcomes. So what does that follow-up and treatment look like? I have some slides that will cover that, talking about the different rates to time to follow-up. Definitely there's some improvement we could make there, as well as inconsistency to access to treatment, which I know this community knows so well. In terms of education and advocacy, I won't go into too much detail on that, but that we know there are varying opportunities, right? Sometimes you see one advocacy organization who seems to have it all and has all the materials and all the languages and everything like that, and then another that is really just struggling to get a website up, right? We know that there are inequities there, and thus that means there's inequities in terms of accessing that education. So, screening equally, or from an equality perspective, does not mean screening at an equity perspective. And we've known this for a while. You may be able to see it in the teeny tiny print that this chart was, this information has been around since 2003. This is not new. But that depending on the analyte and biomarkers that you are looking at, there are different populations that are affected that have either an increased rate of false positives or an increased rate of false negatives. So I put this here to really say, so what are we going to do about it, right? Is this just okay, and are we going to accept that? Do we say, wow, this is something we really want to change? Do we want to see, gosh, we're 20 years out. Just did some math and realizing where my gray hairs came from. But, in maybe 2025 or 2030, do we want to see this chart look different? We have to have those conversations and really think about the inputs into that, not just from a laboratory perspective, but again, what does this mean for long-term health outcomes for people? This is another slide. So for those of you who've been involved in newborn screening, something we've been hearing a lot about for the past decade is timeliness. And if you look, you can kind of see when we think about the rates in terms of from birth to specimen collection, those numbers are pretty similar. From birth to receipt at the lab, also very similar. Even in terms of the time from birth to the actual report, really similar. But again, newborn screening is not about a test and a report. It's about actually getting into care. And once we move into the average amount of time from birth to diagnosis, as well as from birth to intervention, then we're seeing big differences. In both of those categories, a difference of 15 days comparing the white cohort to others. We know, that is the whole point of newborn screening, that days count, that we have to find these kids and get them into intervention as quickly as possible. So this is very, very, very preliminary data, and really appreciate a shout out to Amy Gaviglio, who's pulled this together and has really been a champion in having newborn screening programs look at this data and say, where's there room for improvement? So, access to treatment, we've talked about that, I think, quite a bit actually throughout the day. But, we have the excitement of gene and cell therapy, but we also know that there are large upfront costs for families, even when we're talking about a public health program, right? Again, newborn screening, everyone gets a test, we should be good, right? Still some room for improvement. We also know that there are currently over 500 campaigns for SMA alone on GoFundMe. And we know, when we look at the data from GoFundMe campaigns, those that are put on by Black and brown families typically are not fulfilled, do not get the same amount of money at the same rates as white families that are on there. So we have to be just really honest about that when we're talking about these issues. I did not complete that bullet point, but what I meant to say was, will we all benefit from this promise? We can be really excited about what the future holds, but we have to make sure that that future includes everyone. This is not a new issue. We've seen this in formula and medical foods. We know that there's sometimes not coverage for that. So again, these issues are not new. I want to jump down to this last statement here, which my colleague, Dr. Erin Goldenberg, reminded me of last night in terms of thinking access is just the start of the journey towards equity. So often we talk about, well, if just everyone can have a test or if just everyone has it. Again, that's the start, but the data that I just showed shows that that isn't the sole solution. Getting through it. So where are the opportunities? We really need to keep in mind the needs of all families, and that has to be central, not just to the newborn screening system, but really when we're thinking about health and healthcare. Now, I know that sounds really obvious, but you all know, as all advocates in this room, that we have to continue to remind people that it's not just about the new technology, or it's not just about the new thing we're learning. It's really about, is this making a positive benefit in the lives of families? Really encouraging the work with new partners and experts. I've seen this time and again in newborn screening when people have shared their data and shared some information to really be able to have creative ways to see how we're going to approach this. And lastly, to really incentivize the sharing of data, methodology, educational materials. We can't keep reinventing the wheel, but we have to be able to also still have innovative and new conversations around these issues. I think I have like 1 minute. This is just to highlight some of the work that we do through our newborn screening, one of our newborn screening programs, our Navigate Newborn Screening. The ones that are highlighted in blue, I can't even tell if you can tell that, but really have a concerted effort in terms of thinking about how do we reach communities who oftentimes are left out. So our online learning curriculums are in multiple languages. We do workforce development where we're educating the new generation around issues of newborn screening. We had a prenatal educational initiative that was really focused on Spanish-speaking communities and a number of other pieces. And again, I think someone said earlier today that you just have to start, right? It's not about getting it perfect right off the bat, but it's starting and making sure that we're improving as we go along the way. And lastly, to me, this is the way that I really think of equality and equity. Equality is giving everyone a shoe, right? Every baby gets newborn screening. That's a huge success. Again, this is not to downplay that. But equity is giving everyone a shoe that fits. And so we really need to think about any type of testing that we're doing. How are we making sure that it's meeting the needs of the multitude of communities that are here? Thank you. I think that's it for me.
I don't know about you all, but this is the first panel that I've ever seen meet time, probably in my life. So round of applause to our speakers.
Are we on time?
So do we have time for questions, Priscilla? Okay, perfect. Okay, and I
Question. Oh, you saying
somebody had a?
You had a question?
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah, a couple.
No, you go ahead. Do we have mics around the room? In the meantime, you're loud enough. I think people can hear you.
Mm-hmm.
Sure, thank you. Amazing panel. Thank you all very much for your contributions. I think there was a comment, I think it was from Dr. Cunningham, about democratizing technologies and genomics and genetics. And it feels like that's kind of a theme running through the panel, that when we start to think about the issue that was just raised about newborn screening, it starts to get super complicated and expensive pretty fast. And as you said, some states are struggling to keep the lights on their programs, and other ones are kind of racing ahead. Do you have any thoughts about how we democratize those platforms? How should we be thinking about them? How does entrepreneurship and building opportunities for those STEM students that we heard about both diversify the talent field to the level of the researchers and the opportunities to build new business models in these communities that can be sustainable and can be the next generation of platforms to democratize the hope of genetic analysis?
Yeah, I'll jump on that because I live and breathe this. I'm also a biotech entrepreneur, so I spent a lot of my life trying to develop better diagnostics using genomics. And one of the things that's really exciting in the field is that the actual cost of doing sequencing is going down precipitously. We're now, Illumina just one of the big sequencer companies, just released a sequencer that can sequence whole human genomes faster than ever before, okay? And less expensive than ever before. So we're now at about we're approaching a $100 genome. I think in the next year or so we'll be there. So let's put those numbers into context around newborn screening, because I like doing quick back of the envelope math. I'm a science guy, that's what I do. So if we've got about 4 million or less newborns every year, so to sequence, do a whole genome sequence on all 4 million, that's what, 400 million? And if the cost of burden of rare disease is what, $1 trillion? So we're looking at half of 1% of the cost of the burden of the disease just by doing that simple step of newborn screening. So why aren't we doing it? You see? So I think that needs to be something that everybody in government that has money, I mean, 400 million, I used to work in government. I spent 50 million a year on research, and it didn't always result in something that impactful, right? But 400 million a year for newborn screening, I can see the effect on that, because if 80% of the rare diseases have a genetic component, we're moving the needle. So these become imperatives, and I think the democratization of it will continue to occur as the cost goes down. And everything we can do to drive cost and make some smart investments on the government side in some of these technologies will help us all in the future, I think.
There's another question over there.
I just have a
I was going to add into that. I think, like I said, there's a lot of excitement around where the costs are going down, but we also know costs are rising for everyday families, and so we really need to take that into consideration as well and think how we can approach that, which is why the work of that burden study is so critical for us to really think, how can we really help families throughout this entire journey? Getting the data and getting a diagnosis is so crucial, but so is helping families live with these conditions and really be able to thrive in that. So I think taking that exact same type of excitement and energy and looking at it throughout that patient or family's life journey, and to see, okay, what are the costs and where are the constraints and where are places that we can really alleviate that. That's in education. Does every state need to be creating new materials and websites and all of that? Or could there be centers of excellence around health communication in newborn screening compared to centers of excellence or regionalization around laboratory and that level of expertise? I think there are places that we can really come together and say, you do that really well and you do that really well. So you should do those things well, and we should share and be able to do some exchange in that way.
Other questions?
Another.
I have one in the back. So you guys talked a lot about how to create the importance of a diverse workforce. And coming out of COVID, health workforce is a huge question on Capitol Hill at the moment. Obviously, the Senate just held a hearing on this. And so I'm curious if there's any policies currently be considered on the Hill, any bills or any policy areas that you think would help to contribute to the fact of, as Congress starts to address the need to increase the healthcare workforce, to ensure that that increase is a diverse increase, and making sure that workforce, that they're going to try to create new policies to actually have that diverse workforce, and that we're not just increasing the workforce and having these same issues today, tomorrow.
I can chime in a little bit on that. I mean, again, I just joined this STEM Opportunity Alliance, which I'm very excited about, because the White House Office of Science and Technology Policy, as well as the American Association for Advancement in Science and other large nonprofits and corporate foundations have come together to try to address this issue. It's an ongoing issue that we've had for a while. And as you mentioned, this sort of lack of diversity is just sort of a systemic problem that's continued. So we're going to be really working hard on that task force to come up with some actionable, things that we can do to really move the needle, where other things have kind of failed in the past. And so I'm pretty excited about it. I don't know what the outcome is going to be, but I think we are talking about some real metrics around diversity and inclusion. Because here's the thing that I often notice when I go to sort of events and we talk about diversity. What does it really mean? What is the benchmark? If I say I want a more diverse faculty, okay? If I started with a faculty that has 2 black people on it and I add a black person, I've increased the diversity of my faculty. But if my faculty has 150 members, right, my percentage of diversity is not commensurate with black people's representation in our society. So how do we define what those metrics are? We're going to be doing some of that work on the committee and then coming up with some interventions that we can really address it. But it is a systemic problem, and all of us, that's why I asked you guys that question. If you know somebody that's in STEM, if you don't, encourage them to get in there, because we need more people doing research on all these problems to help us solve them.
I would just add that I think it also comes down to intention. So, and really thinking about what are those barriers. Why we know that, individuals from many different backgrounds are extremely smart and ingenuous, but where are those opportunities and what are the barriers to getting to those opportunities? So, whether, I think we've learned a lot now about standardized testing and how, that is really going to bias who ends up getting into certain institutions, because that test is people are going to do well based on their, more so based on their social economic background than their intelligence or their abilities. So just really acknowledging that as we are moving forward with these efforts to increase the workforce. It's important.
And I'll add briefly, even though I'm the moderator, I think that it's more important at this point. It's important for us to increase diversity, but with what we have right now, it's important that they're learning about diversity, equity, and inclusion, and also thinking about, because we have our population of what we have. So with that being said, what do we teach them? What do we include in their medical curriculum that is going to teach them about biases, that is going to teach them about misconceptions, that is going to teach them about how do you build trust and rapport with your patients, that's going to teach them about, yes, you have 5 minutes to talk to someone, but what does that 5 minutes look like? It doesn't necessarily have to be that I'm just collecting your blood pressure, but while I'm collecting your blood pressure, let's talk about some things that are happening. Why were you late to your appointment today? Maybe you had a transportation issue. So thinking through, being strategic about recognizing that we have what we have right now, how do we embrace what we have by also, at the same time, increasing diversity over the workforce in general? Any other questions? Okay, many. We have one in the back. I'll let him go.
Hi there, I have a question, and it relates to workforce, which is a huge problem. I know of too many stories, even in the most privileged environments, where people are 12 months out from a consult. In our own disease community, we've discovered how desperately affected the marginalized communities are with these rare diseases, and we have social workers working with them. Is there a place for combined degree genetic counseling, social work programs, and are there institutions that are offering both and where this could be done? I just think that would be such incredible training to give them the chops of medical counseling as well as the facility to deal with really marginalized communities.
So I don't know of one for social work specifically. There are some joint programs with genetic counseling and public health to really come from that perspective and to learn more about that perspective. There's also nurses that can be trained in genetics, and so that's a whole kind of expertise within nursing, and I think is a valuable piece of the workforce of individuals that come with that nursing training, but then have this extensive knowledge in genetics and talking about genetic testing. Because one place that we're getting to with genetics, even as we get to this $100 genome, is that there's not going to be enough genetic counselors, right? And so you're going to have general practitioners that at least are, have some understanding of genetics and how those test results come back to truly understand and translate that for patients. While we're going through these efforts of increasing the number of genetic counselors and getting those specifically more genetically trained professionals out there.
And just to add to that, I believe Sarah Lawrence had, and they may still have, a joint program where you can get go to their genetic counseling program, but they also had a certificate in health advocacy, which really, talked about a lot of the things that we are talking about today. But I really echo what Barbara was saying in terms of really we have to think much more globally and broader. Some of the workforce development work we've done has actually been going to undergraduate classes and talking about genetics, talking about newborn screening. And we say, majority of the people in that room will probably have a kid at some point. Great, that's one educational point. Most of these people, even though they may be juniors and seniors, and who knows where life will take them, believe they are going into the health field, either as nutritionists or other roles. So they're getting that education too. And so really thinking of creative ways to influence the healthcare field in a lot of different ways, as well as kind of what you were pointing to in terms of those dual programs.
Okay, so that's the last question we're going to officially take. However, I don't want to speak for the panel, but I'm sure they'll still be willing to answer questions along the way. But thank you all so much for participating today. Thank you so much, EveryLife, for allowing this opportunity for everyone to gather to talk about these topics.
Good job. Got it in, got it out. Good. One home run. Take your kid to baseball.
Okay, it's right here. You're welcome.
Thank you again to all of you for being here to do this panel. This was amazing. So thank you so much for taking the time. I know that we all really appreciate it. I just wanted to give you guys a few closing remarks before you all head out today. Tomorrow you will receive an email that has a Rare Disease Week survey to fill out on all of the events that take part in Rare Disease Week. We want to hear your feedback, what you loved, what you maybe didn't love, and those who complete the survey by Monday will be entered into a drawing for a travel reimbursement to attend Rare Disease Week next year. So definitely get the survey filled out by Monday. Just to give you a rundown for the rest of today and tomorrow, we are going to have the YAR Leadership Academy graduation from 6 to 7. If you're interested in watching this, it's going to be live streamed on the Rare Disease Week Attendee Corner. We also have a meetup for our young adult advocates from 7 to 8. It is going to be at the Rare Hub. If you need to get this address, it is on the Rare Disease Week website, so check that out. And then again, tomorrow we will start the day with the caucus briefing at 9 o'clock. We will then all go to our Hill meetings. We'll meet up at 4:30, get a wonderful group photo on the Capitol stairs, and then we'll have the Rare Artist reception from 5 to 7 tomorrow. Again, this is the information for the young adult meetup. If you're interested, the address is here on the screen. You could take a photo. I'll leave it up for you for a second. If you are interested in taking the metro, the closest metro stop is McPherson Square on the orange and blue line. If you are on the red line, Farragut North is going to be the closest. So if you're a young adult in the crowd, I hope that you will join this meetup. It's going to be a lot of fun. And then, of course, the caucus briefing is tomorrow from 9 to 10. It is going to be amazing. Breakfast will be there. Most importantly, coffee will be there. So we hope that you guys will join us. Again, the red scarves that you received in your bag, wear those on the Hill tomorrow so that everyone will know who you are with. Also wear it for the group photo so you guys are all matching. And the group photo is going to be on the Capitol stairs facing the Supreme Court building, not the side facing the National Mall. So be sure to meet us there at 4:30. And then the Rare Artist reception is going to be so much fun. It is going to be in the Hart Senate office building from 5 to 7 tomorrow after your meetings end. We'll have appetizers, we will have beverages, and we're going to celebrate our rare artist. And it's going to be a great time. So I hope you guys will join us. Again, here is the map for the day tomorrow. We are going to be at the Capitol all day tomorrow. So familiarize yourself with this map. The Senate offices are all on one side, the Capitol's in the middle, the House offices are all on the other side. And as I mentioned earlier, if you are coming for meetings, make sure to get there early so you have time to go through security. One tip I don't think I mentioned earlier that I want to make sure you all know is if you have House meetings back to back, instead of going out of the House building you're in to go into the next House office building, use the tunnels. It's going to save you so much time. You won't have to go through security again. And same for the Senate side. You can do the same thing to get through to all the Senate buildings. So thank you guys for spending this day with us, sitting and listening to all of the amazing panelists. And thank you to all the panelists, of course. So just a round of applause for all of you guys. Thank you for being here. We'll see you guys tomorrow.